I'm not under arrest. I didn't do nothing. For what? For what? Can you tell me for what? For what? I'm under arrest for what? No. If you got the wrong guy, I'm suing all of you guys. Let me get your card. Can I get your card? Can I get your card? Officers. Hey, yo. Hey, officer. No. Matter of fact, look at my ID. You guys are racial profile thinking I'm somebody. My ID's in my back pocket. Watch how funny this is. Go ahead, look at it. No, don't hate me. Look at it. Oh, what does that say? What does that say? Oh!
Malcolm Rivers sat alone at a corner table under the restaurant's string lights, smoking a cigarette and trying to relax after a long day. He wore a red t-shirt and jeans, blending in with the casual crowd around him. It should have been an ordinary night, quiet and forgettable. Malcolm wasn't doing anything unusual, and he certainly didn't expect to be noticed by the police for any reason at all. Officer Brent Hanley walked across the sidewalk with the confidence of someone who believed he was already right. He came straight to Malcolm's table and told him he thought he was the man with a warrant. Malcolm looked up, calm but annoyed. He had seen situations like this many times, both in real life and in training videos. He asked Hanley what made him so sure. Hanley simply said he thought Malcolm was the guy. That one word told Malcolm everything he needed to know. A moment later, a second officer, Logan Pierce, arrived and immediately backed Hanley up. Both of them stared at Malcolm with the same fixed expression, as if his appearance alone proved something. Malcolm kept his hands visible and tried to explain where his ID was, hoping they would slow down and listen. But neither officer cared about listening. They treated his questions like he was arguing instead of trying to help. Malcolm could feel the shift in the air, the moment when officers stop checking facts and start forcing their own version of the story. "You're racially profiling me," Malcolm said, keeping his voice steady but firm. The words landed hard, but Hanley didn't back down. He only repeated that they believed he had a warrant. Malcolm told them that belief was an illusion, but the officers were already too deep in their assumptions to hear it. Their confidence grew harder and the situation escalated faster than it should have. Without warning, Pierce grabbed Malcolm's arm. Malcolm told them not to manhandle him, pulling back as they tried to force his hands behind his back. The struggle lasted only a few seconds but looked messy and unnecessary, especially with people eating dinner just a few feet away. One officer alone couldn't hold him, so more hands joined in, grabbing and pulling until the handcuffs finally snapped closed around his wrists. The click of the metal was quiet, but it felt loud enough to echo. Malcolm sat there in the cuffs, breathing steadily even though anger burned under the surface. His mind ran through facts, procedures, and everything he knew about the law. He thought about what he would write later, about what the video would show, about how wrong this entire situation was. He had taught rookies about probable cause, about avoiding bias, about how easy it is for officers to let assumptions guide bad decisions. And now he was sitting there as proof of how little some people learned. He told the officers that his ID was in his back pocket and that they should check it. One officer reached in, pulled out Malcolm's wallet, and opened it. The moment the license came into view, everything changed. Both officers stared at it in silence. Their expressions cracked. Their certainty collapsed. Someone nearby, the single person recording the whole thing on a phone, shouted in disbelief as the truth became obvious. The officers looked at the ID, then at Malcolm, then at the ID again. For the first time that night, they finally understood they had handcuffed the wrong man, and there was no excuse left to hide behind. The moment the officers saw Malcolm's federal ID, the entire mood shifted. Their confidence drained so quickly it left behind a silence heavy enough to weigh down the air. The photograph on the card, the credentials, the agency name, all of it was unmistakably real, and none of it matched the man they believed they had detained. Pierce stared at the card as if hoping it would change, while Hanley's expression tightened into something closer to panic than authority. Malcolm didn't wait for them to gather themselves. His patience had already been stretched to the limit. With his wrists still trapped in the cuffs, he leaned forward slightly and told them firmly to take them off. There wasn't anger in the volume of his voice, but in the sharp control of it, the way each word carried a warning. Both officers hesitated, unsure of how to respond now that they stood exposed. The hesitation irritated him even more. because it proved they still didn't fully grasp the seriousness of what they had done. He repeated the command, making it clear there would be no discussion. Only then did Handley step forward with the key, fumbling slightly as he unlocked the restraints. The metal loosened and the cuffs fell away, leaving faint red marks on Malcolm's skin. He rubbed at them slowly, letting the soreness register before looking back up at the two officers, who were now standing rigid and uncertain. The crowd around them reacted in low murmurs, some expressing disbelief, others frustration. Their voices didn't grow loud, but the message was clear. The officers had made a serious mistake, and there was no hiding from it. Malcolm let the moment sit for a few seconds before speaking again, his words steady and cutting. He told them plainly that they had detained the wrong person, acted on nothing more than appearance, and refused to listen even when he explained they had the wrong man. He reminded them they had ignored his warnings and pushed forward with certainty that had no basis in fact. Handley attempted to recover, saying they were trying to verify information, but Malcolm shut it down immediately. He told them verification should have come before force, before grabbing him, before placing him in cuffs in front of a restaurant full of people. Their mistake wasn't just procedural, it came from choosing assumptions over evidence. Without giving them a chance to respond, Malcolm demanded to see their supervisor. His tone made it clear he wasn't asking. The officers exchanged a quick glance, both of them uncomfortable, then contacted their supervisor without argument. As they waited, Malcolm held out his hand and instructed each officer to give him their identification cards. It wasn't a request, and the officers knew it. They reached into their pockets with stiff movements, pulling out their cards and handing them to him with trembling hands. Malcolm took each one carefully, examining their names before slipping the cards into his pocket. When the supervisor arrived, he paused at the sight of Malcolm's ID in Pierce's hand and the red marks on Malcolm's wrists. His confusion lasted only a moment before the seriousness settled in. Malcolm explained the situation clearly from beginning to end, describing how the officers approached him with nothing more than a thought and escalated without verifying anything. Handley attempted weakly to justify their actions, but the supervisor quieted him almost immediately and focused on Malcolm. The supervisor unlocked what remained of the cuffs and apologized, but Malcolm made it clear that an apology wouldn't erase the moment or the choice the officers made. He stated plainly that they had embarrassed him and acted with bias, and the supervisor didn't argue. The crowd around them murmured again in agreement, underscoring the truth Malcolm had been forced to prove. The damage had already been done, and Malcolm's expression made it obvious that this was only the beginning of the accountability he intended to pursue. Malcolm and his friend moved away from the restaurant, trying to put distance between themselves and the tension still hovering in the air. Even as they walked, Malcolm felt the pressure of the moment lingering in his chest, his wrists aching with a steady reminder of how quickly things had spiraled. His friend stayed close, watching him carefully, giving him space to speak when he was ready. For a few steps, neither said anything, letting the noise of passing cars fill the quiet. When his friend finally asked if he was all right, Malcolm answered honestly that he wasn't, though he supposed he would be eventually. They walked toward a quieter part of the block, the glow of the restaurant lights fading behind them, and Malcolm felt the frustration rising again as the distance grew. The night had been simple until the officers appeared, and now it had become something he would have to carry for a long time. He stopped near a low concrete ledge and asked if they could sit for a moment. His friend nodded and joined him. Malcolm leaned forward, elbows on his knees, trying to release tension that refused to leave his shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice was low but steady, shaped by anger and exhaustion. He said he couldn't understand how sitting at a table had become enough to trigger force, and how quickly the officers had decided he was someone he wasn't. His friend agreed, pointing out that the officers had not paused to check anything before rushing to detain him. Malcolm nodded, saying that was exactly the problem. It wasn't about facts, it was about assumptions, and he was tired of being on the receiving end of them. He explained that he had spent years teaching others how to handle situations without bias, how to slow down, how to ask questions, and how to avoid the very kind of mistake that had just happened. His friend listened quietly, letting Malcolm process the moment. Malcolm said the officers never saw him for who he actually was. They only saw a black man who they believed matched their expectations. His friend asked what he planned to do next, and Malcolm straightened slightly as something more focused settled into him. He said he was going to hold them accountable by filing a complaint first thing in the morning, then notifying the Department of Justice, and finally alerting his supervisors at the Bureau. He made it clear he wouldn't allow the incident to be brushed aside or hidden. His friend agreed that accountability was necessary and said Malcolm had every right to push this forward. Malcolm rubbed his wrists again, the soreness deepening the frustration he felt. He said that what bothered him most wasn't just the force or the public humiliation. It was the realization that if he hadn't been calm, or if he hadn't had federal credentials, or if no one had been watching, the situation could have ended in a much worse way. His friend's expression tightened, and Malcolm said this was the reality for so many people who don't have a badge or years of training to fall back on. This, he explained, was why he couldn't ignore what happened, and why he needed to pursue it fully. His friend rested a hand on his shoulder, telling him to do exactly that. Malcolm nodded and stood up again, his frustration now shaped into determination. He looked back toward the restaurant lights one more time, feeling the sting of the moment but also the beginning of something else, clarity about what needed to happen next. He wasn't walking away shaken anymore, he was walking away ready. The officers had made their choices, and Malcolm intended to make his own. He knew this was only the beginning of a much larger process, and he was prepared to see it through. The next morning arrived before it felt ready for it. He had slept lightly, waking several times with the memory of the officer's hands on him and the cold bite of the cuffs pressing into his wrists. When the sun finally rose, he gave up on sleep altogether and went straight to the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the determination to turn last night's anger into action. His notebook sat open in front of him as he began writing down everything he remembered. The words came easily because the details were still sharp in his mind. The moment Hanley claimed he thought Malcolm had a warrant, the grip on his arm, the confusion in the crowd, and the disbelief on the officers' faces when they realized the mistake they had made. He wrote until the page was full, then flipped to the next and continued. When his friend messaged him asking if he was all right, Malcolm replied briefly that he was handling it today. There was no point in talking about it anymore. It was time to do something concrete. By mid-morning, Malcolm walked into the Rochester Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. The atmosphere inside was quiet and procedural, the kind of place where everything felt controlled and monitored. The woman at the desk greeted him politely, and when he explained why he was there, she glanced down at the documents he placed in front of her. Her expression shifted quickly when she saw his federal credentials and the stack of officer business cards he had collected the night before. She led him to a private interview room where a senior investigator entered a few minutes later. The man introduced himself calmly and took a seat across from Malcolm, clipboard ready. He asked Malcolm to explain the events in order, and Malcolm did so clearly, describing how the officers approached him, how they never verified anything before placing him in cuffs, and how the situation unraveled once they checked his ID. The investigator listened without interrupting, taking notes as Malcolm laid out each moment in detail, including what the video recorded by the bystander had captured. When Malcolm finished, the investigator said the case would move quickly based on what he had seen. He also mentioned that neither of the officers involved were strangers to complaints. Malcolm nodded, unsurprised. He thanked the investigator and left the building with a feeling that something had finally begun. Over the next several weeks, the investigation unfolded. He received follow-up calls requesting clarification and timestamps. The bystander's video began circulating online, slowly gaining attention. Local news outlets picked up the story, and discussions spread across social media about profiling and wrongful detainment. Malcolm didn't engage with the comments, but he watched the conversations carefully, noticing how many people shared similar stories or frustrations. It reminded him that what happened to him wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a much larger issue. Then one afternoon, while Malcolm was finishing paperwork at home, the phone rang. The Internal Affairs investigator spoke with a tone that carried both formality and finality. He explained that the department had reached a conclusion. Officer Brent Hanley would be terminated for violating multiple policies and acting without reasonable cause. Officer Logan Pierce would receive a lengthy suspension, mandatory retraining, and a permanent disciplinary record. The supervisor who responded at the scene had recommended wide-reaching reviews of department procedures. Malcolm listened quietly, absorbing each part of the decision. The investigator added that Malcolm's professionalism during the night of the incident and throughout the complaint process had played a major role in the clarity of the findings. Malcolm thanked him for the update and ended the call, standing still for a moment as the news settled over him. It wasn't satisfaction he felt exactly, but a sense of balance returning. Later that evening, he met his friend for coffee. When asked if anything had happened, Malcolm nodded and explained the outcome. His friend smiled and said it was deserved. Malcolm agreed, though he also made it clear the issue wasn't only about punishment, it was about the message it sent. People deserve to sit in public spaces without fear of being targeted, and officers needed to be reminded that assumptions were not evidence. His friend raised his cup in a small toast, and Malcolm lifted his own. For the first time since that night, he felt the weight on his chest ease just a little. Nothing erased the experience, but at least the truth had been recognized, and that mattered. In the days that followed the disciplinary decision, Malcolm found himself thinking less about the officers and more about the people who watched the incident unfold. He replayed the moment in his head. Not the struggle, not even the handcuffs, but the faces in the crowd. Some had looked shocked, others frustrated, and a few simply tired, as if the scene repeating in front of them was only the latest example of something they had seen far too many times. He thought about how quickly the situation could have escalated and how different the outcome might have been if he had reacted out of fear instead of discipline. One evening, he decided to take a walk through the same area where the incident occurred. He didn't sit at a table or stay along, but he wanted to stand in the spot where everything had changed. The restaurant looked the same, warm lights, people laughing, a familiar smell drifting from the open windows. But the memory of that night layered itself over the scene. It wasn't trauma he felt exactly. It was a reminder of how easily a peaceful moment could turn into something else, simply because someone refused to second-guess their assumptions. His friend joined him, and they stood there quietly for a moment. His friend asked him if returning felt strange. Malcolm nodded and said it did. But he also said he wanted to look at the place one more time, not as the victim of a wrongful detainment, but as a man who had faced it, confronted it, and pushed back through the proper channels. He wasn't looking for closure, just perspective. They continued walking down the sidewalk, and Malcolm spoke about the internal investigation and the outcome. He explained that while the officers faced consequences, it still didn't erase what had happened. What mattered most was that mistakes like this were documented, addressed, and used as evidence for necessary changes within policing. He mentioned that he had already spoken to his bureau supervisors, who had supported him fully and encouraged him to remain vocal about the incident, especially since it reflected a larger pattern affecting communities across the country. His friend asked him whether he planned to pursue anything further. Malcolm said yes, that he intended to meet with community leaders and civil rights advocates to help ensure incidents like his weren't ignored or forgotten. He believed the momentum around the video and the public reaction created an opportunity for broader discussion. If an off-duty FBI agent could be thrown into cuffs on a sidewalk without verification, then countless others without badges, training, or witnesses were facing far greater risk. He paused for a moment and added that the outcome should not be considered exceptional. It should be the standard response whenever officers act on bias rather than evidence. His friend agreed and reminded him that many people were grateful he had spoken up, because his story gave weight to a problem often dismissed. Malcolm went home later that night feeling something new, not relief, but resolve. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, drafting a letter addressed to the city's Civilian Oversight Board. He introduced himself, summarized the incident, and offered to assist in future trainings to help officers understand how implicit bias affects decision-making. He didn't want retaliation, he wanted reform. He wanted officers to think before they acted. He wanted people to exist in public spaces without fear. Before he closed the laptop, he reread the letter and added one more sentence at the end. Situations like mine cannot be treated as isolated mistakes. They must be used as lessons. A week later, he received a reply, thanking him for reaching out and inviting him to speak at an upcoming review session. Malcolm accepted immediately. He believed true accountability was an ongoing process, not a single disciplinary action. On the night he stood in front of a room filled with officers, supervisors, and community members, he spoke calmly and clearly about what happened. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers. He described the experience exactly as it felt: the shock, the embarrassment, the anger, and the danger of assumptions turning into force. He emphasized how quickly confidence had blinded the officers and how easily verification could have prevented everything. When he finished, the room was quiet. Some officers looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful, but Malcolm could tell they were listening, really listening, and that was enough for him. The experience had changed him, but it had also opened a door. He walked through it, determined to make sure that what happened on that sidewalk wouldn't be repeated without accountability. And as he left the room that night, he felt a steady sense of purpose guiding him forward. Though the incident had bruised his dignity, it had strengthened his resolve. And Malcolm Rivers, once seen as the wrong man, was now making sure others would never be mistaken so easily again.